If you liked this episode of the Hockey IQ podcast, please leave a like, a comment, and especially review our podcast. If you truly listened all the way to the end and you're listening to this right now, you enjoyed this episode. Please go and give it a 5-star review. That helps us out more than you know. Thank you so much and look forward to the next one. On the Hockey IQ podcast today, we bring on Philip O'Callahan. Did I pronounce that right? I usually butcher names.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's perfect.
Perfect. Irish is a tough one for me, but you can tell us all about it. Being one, not only a phenomenal writer and content creator, but also an Irish teacher.
Yeah, so it's kind of in Ireland, when you're, so my primary degree would have been a PE teaching degree, so physical education, but you have to teach two subjects. So that was my other one that I had to study while I was in college and that I'm teaching as well at the moment. So, yeah, the Irish names can be tough to pronounce. Mine's kind of one of the easier ones. There's a lot harder out there.
Truly. But want to dive straight into it. So we were talking prior to this and getting to know each other, and I was talking about like, all right, how did you get into kind of like this online community, starting to help others um, develop the idea around skill acquisition, and how do we best do that as coaches? And I think it's really curious that you reading a research paper every single Friday. Like, why was that even a goal of yours in the first place? Like, that's quite noble.
Um, yeah, I suppose I got kind of interested in the skill acquisition stuff while I was studying for my PE teaching degree. So Um, before I went in, I was only doing a small bit of coaching. I went into college when I was 18 or whatever. And with the tennis coaching, as a kind of tennis player, so I was playing kind of just in Ireland. Ireland isn't kind of renowned for its tennis prowess, but um, we a lot of time you'd end up kind of when you're practicing, you have to kind of design your own practice sessions or practice, um, because you don't have a coach there all the time. So you kind of just go up and play and try practice. So, I was always kind of trying different things in those sessions. And then as I got into college, we kind of came across the kind of games based, the kind of TGFU, which is teaching games for understanding, and the kind of different game based approaches. And then I kind of started to come across more about the kind of, I suppose, the constraint side approach online. And I just kind of became fascinated. I listened to all the podcasts. I started reading a lot of the research papers. I was kind of weird and actually enjoyed reading papers at home at night just for enjoyment. So, and just to try to deepen my understanding. And then it was kind of during COVID, maybe 2021, that I started kind of sharing stuff on Twitter. So I had started sharing some stuff on Instagram, but I just wasn't really enjoying it. And then um, I was at home. From I had I think I tested positive, or one of my housemates had tested positive for COVID, so I had to stay away from school for 2 weeks and I had time at home. So um, I decided it was a good idea to set a goal of just trying to read one paper every week, and then I kind of, to hold myself accountable, I just posted a little thread on Twitter about the paper every week, and people started to enjoy it, and like that, I suppose that kind of gave me a bit of motivation to keep going because people, I remember I missed it once, and someone asked me where was it? So, um, that was good kind of accountability, and it kind of then I just started getting into sharing a bit more stuff, besides just the Friday kind of research thread or whatever. So that's kind of where it all started.
Now, every other week we get to enjoy your newsletter popping into our inbox. So love that.
Yeah.
I'm deadly curious about, okay, we're learning all of this, but a lot of the secret and the beautiful sauce of this is actually like, how do we go and implement it? Like, as you're learning and evolving, as you're getting into this, like, what did you take and apply, whether it be to the classroom, to your own sessions, to any kind of private coaching?
Yeah, I was having a conversation with another coach this week, and we one of the things that he kind of pointed out was I kind of came into it as a player, because like I started applying the ideas in my own practice, and then it was a kind of a nice way to kind of get used to it because like it was only me. I wasn't kind of no one was paying me to coach. I was kind of designing my own sessions, so kind of a risk-free environment. And then, um, as like say with PE teaching, you're going to be applying it in loads of different sports. So trying to kind of with loads of kind of different levels of students, there's some in the class that are going to be really, really into sports. Some that's the only time they actually exercise during the week. So trying to get those kind of ideas in that environment was challenging, but it was really rewarding because like you're doing it in sports you might not have been as comfortable in. And then yeah, just kind of grew in confidence and kind of became like I got very comfortable doing it in kind of the tennis sessions then that I was doing. So that's kind of how I got into applying it into practice.
So can you give us an example of that? You mentioned that, it's a challenge to get some of these ideas into your PE class. Like
Yeah.
what were the big challenges that you had to overcome and how did you go about it? What would be an example of it?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a few. Um, so the first one would be you have like how can you challenge all the different levels of learners in a kind of in a suitable way. So one of the ways I do that sometimes is just by having like different versions of the same activity running. So like one's easier, one's kind of medium, one's kind of harder, and the students can kind of pick which one they go to themselves. So if I was doing I don't know, a basketball game or something like that. For one of the easier group, they might have a smaller ball and the hoop might be lower. On the medium one, um, the hoop might just or the hoop might be the same size, but the ball might be a bit easier. And then in the hard one, it's just a kind of normal kind of basketball where they're kind of getting used to the thing. So um, that was a way that kind of I found worked quite like that was just a simple example, but that's I suppose some of the ways I found it kind of useful applying that in PE. Another hard one is it can look like you maybe don't have as much control over the sessions because they're a bit messier and the kids have a bit more freedom. So it's kind of, or the players have a lot more freedom. So it's kind of getting comfortable not not like telling them exactly what to do and letting them explore and just kind of how to manage that environment effectively so they're all kind of enjoying themselves exploring and like learning is the kind of big thing.
So I like this idea of like how do you right size the challenge? Um,
Yeah.
and like I was thinking back to something I do in ice hockey where if we're doing a skating drill, I always tell players, I'm like, keep adding a puck until it's a challenge for you, like a right size challenge. Like the players that come in and they say they're at the lower level where they're coming from, they may struggle just with skating and no puck. And then I've got these players that are coming from the highest level and they've got two pucks and they're doing the skating activity. So there's all these like variables of like how are they loading themselves cognitively, but also like physically, how does this interaction affect? Because like for me, I'm always like skating development's great, but it needs to be within relation to the puck. Like how do we help that? Because a player can be a great skater without it, but if they're a bad skater with it, that's a problem. So how can we right size that challenge? And even like the hoop size. So I'm just thinking like hockey, like USA Hockey, for example, was trying to get smaller nets at the younger ages because it's just more realistic. Um, it's a super big challenge. We've got this massive hockey net, and you got this little starting kid. Like he can only fill maybe a fourth of the net. Like it's a big issue to overcome. I'm curious what else you might have up your sleeve more than just basketball.
Yeah, so there's actually if you're listening to this, there's a cool video. I think you can look it up on YouTube where they make they bring in a group of soccer coaches, and I think they do it for hockey. There's a hockey version as well, and they just
Yes, there
make the
is.
goals huge, and they make the pitch really big, and like the coaches like are struggling so much, and they're like, it's just kind of I suppose showing them what it's like for those young kids if they were playing on the full size. So yeah, if so to get the challenge right, like the and like I suppose you can kind of apply this to any kind of sport is um we'd kind of use the idea, it's something called like task simplification. Um so what we try to do is we try to kind of simplify the kind of execution of the kind of skill or the kind of act or movement solution or whatever you want to call it, while kind of maintaining some of the kind of important information that's going to help them develop their decision making skills and things like that. So um you can do things like you could modify the ball, you could make the you could start the defender slightly more out of position to give them a bit more time. You could change the numbers of the task. So like if you're like say if it was a soccer match, if it's 11 versus 11, there's a lot more kind of complexity in 11 against 11 game when there's more players. But if you make it 2 against 2, or even use kind of like give the attacking team maybe an extra player, 3 versus 2 temporary, so you could have the like other defender kind of recovering. So they have like a kind of 5 seconds where it's kind of 3 against 2, and then there's a defender coming, something like that. So um and then you can also kind of do things like so we so I did equipment players, um, and then you can yeah the equipment and those ones are probably the biggest ones. So like that would be kind of called scaling. So you're kind of scaling the equipment or the playing area or the task kind of instructions or rules to kind of suit the levels of the players you're working at to kind of suitably challenge them. And then as they get better, then you can gradually increase the challenge to kind of make it more towards the game. So you can use slightly more challenging equipment. You could um bring it back from a 3 versus 2 to 3 against 3, or even to 5 versus 5, kind of things like that. So that's kind of one of the ways I'd kind of try to suitably challenge all the players, is using that idea in practice.
I love the idea of like you mentioned, like the challenge within the activity. Like a classic example in hockey is like you just take away whatever the player's best at. Like you can't do that anymore. Find another way just to kind of get them out
Yeah,
of the process of like going back to the same well every time of like, oh, I had success at that once. I'm gonna keep doing it. Well, no, you got to try something different. Or like we'll do a small sided game and each team has a secret bonus multiplier. So they're trying to manufacture that as a way of getting a little more creative, just expanding the horizons.
yeah,
Right? Like
definitely, and
that's the
just
idea.
yeah, and kind of just trying to keep the activities as kind of close enough to the kind of conditions of the game that they'd be kind of exploring. So like even a nice way in that example that you shared of like the person that's kind of using the same thing all the time, how could you so like if they were scoring that way all the time, now if you score like that, that's worth 1 goal. But if you score a different way, it's worth 3. So then they're going to be kind of incentivized to maybe explore the other ways of scoring. Because like I'd make it, sometimes I'd do it like in that example, I'd make it like first to 15 goals. So you can score that way 15 times, or you can try score another way 5. And they're like, okay, this is going to take me forever to score this way 15 times. But if I kind of explore the other way, I can get there faster. So like you're not removing that option. If they want to do that option, they can, but there's kind of encouraged to explore the other ones.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
incentive, not the
yeah,
requirement. Like the classic
yeah,
example in ice hockey is like you want to see more passing. So you say you've got to make 3 passes before you shoot.
yeah,
And to your point, you remove like, well, they're on a breakaway. It's just them and the goalie. Why would they stop playing, make 3 passes, then go? It's like, how do you still get the risk reward in there and go towards what you want? So maybe it's an added point for each pass before we shoot.
yeah. That's a really nice example. I was just gonna say like if you a nice way is like the the amount of the goal is the amount of passes in the task. So if you pass 5 times, the goal is worth 5. If you it's worth 2 if there's 2 passes, but if you're on a breakaway, you should just take that 2
Yeah,
kind
I
of
know a
the
lot of
goal.
coaches like, hey, you score off a one timer, that's
Yeah,
automatically double points.
mhm.
Again, incentivizing that. Um, so I like how we've been talking about CLA without calling it CLA and using all the fancy jargon. This is great.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose like a lot of like the CLA is like the constraint set approach for maybe those that aren't familiar with it. So like I suppose a lot of the some of the kind of the things that we've been talking about are things that coaches maybe have like would have potentially been doing for years. It's just I suppose the CLA gives maybe more of a theory and an explanation of why these things work or why you might want to do these things. So yeah, like we can get a small bit more into the theory side if you'd like, or I don't mind just kind of giving more practical examples. I kind of like trying to make it as kind of practical for coaches as possible so they kind of, and if they'd like to know a bit more theory, then like kind of pointing them towards good
Yeah,
places
this
to
is
look.
a practical podcast. We're not
Perfect.
getting too
Yeah,
theoretical. We got
perfect.
to go there every once in a while to bring it
Yeah,
back and make it a little more in context, just like we would for a practice environment. But yeah, I love
yeah,
practical examples that we can provide anyone. So that kind of brings me to where I want to go with this, which is like us as the adults are trying to create better learning environments for our players. Um, you know, when we think about this, I'll give the first one because you already mentioned it was just like representativeness. Like it needs to look like things that they're going to see in some shape or form when they go to actually play the game. Would be maybe
yeah,
some others, or like if you want to dive into that further, go for it.
yeah. So I suppose like with the one you just mentioned, the kind of representativeness. So um, that came from like a term that was representative task design. So, like it was a scientist called Brunswick. It was from the 1950s. We don't need to go into that, but it was that the like experiments that they were designing represented the environment or like the thing that they were measuring. So with representative learning design though, we don't want to represent it exactly. So like if we were playing a fully representative task would be like the full game of ice hockey. So what we really want to do is we want to kind of just capture the key information. So like in tennis, that might be, um, or even in hockey, you'd have a defender, you'd have an opponent, you might have a teammate, you'd have a, um, like the puck would be present, all that stuff. So you're trying to kind of keep the key information for decision making, but we might just reduce the kind of complexity of the task. So that was the kind of task simplification that we talked about, and I suppose all these ideas kind of link to what what is learning, I suppose, and what is skill. So, if we were looking at skill from a kind of constraints-led approach or CLA perspective, it would be about like skill adaptability. So, it's about the ability to adapt to the environment, what's happening, the different task conditions, rather than like the ability to just kind of reproduce the same kind of movement that you might have done in practice. It's so when we look at skill as the ability to adapt to different contexts, that's we kind of shape our practices around that. So we're developing that ability rather than like the ability to repeat the same thing. So that's where that's probably an important kind of distinction to make at the start.
All right, so maybe we just go down some more principles of great practice design because you keep
Yeah,
touching on a lot of them. So we've already kind of touched on what we'll call the manipulation of constraints. Like we're changing net sizes, we're changing areas, we're changing numbers, rules, etc. Like that's a great way of having a good learning environment for the players. I think that the next one would just be kind of what you talked about, which is you want to give them the repetitions to see the play, but you don't want them to consistently be giving the same solution every single time. It needs to be um, repetition without repetition. Like you're
yeah,
not seeking to repeat the solution, you're repeating the problem set, and there's kind of like that cat and mouse game between you and an opponent. Some people do like the dummy pressure to start, and then they, get more and more of a challenge. So, you think about right sizing a challenge, which I just want to put a quick story there of like there was a U12 hockey coach, like Hall of Fame NHL player himself, who, normally coaches, you go through the coaching ranks, you build yourself up. But he literally went from coaching his son's team at U12 to the NHL, the highest level of the game. In his first practice, he was just talking about like, I just got to right size the timing and the spacing. Like, we're pretty much going to use the same principles. Like, it's still good learning and growth principles. It's just I got to figure out the sizing based on the athletes I have. Um, because his idea was like, okay, we want to provide these rich learning environments, and we want to get the repetitions, but it's a repetition of trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to go about solving these problems and right sizing that spacing to give those proper, the representative, all these things we're talking about.
Yeah, no, I like that. So yeah, I suppose with the like one of the ones we had just kind of mentioned was the kind of constraints. So when we're using the constraints-led approach, we're manipulating constraints. So when we're kind of looking at constraints, we kind of look at them like the factors that are kind of going to influence or shape the kind of solutions that the players are going to use. So a lot of the time, and I made the mistake when I was starting it, was like constraints can kind of have like a negative barrier, or like you can kind of use them to force certain things, whereas we're just kind of using them to kind of like guide or influence or shape the kind of solutions that the players are going to use. So with the repetition without repetition, so that was kind of a concept that was born in the 1930s, a Russian scientist called Nikolai Bernstein. He was kind of employed to like the labor had to be I suppose increased because of the wars. So he was studying blacksmiths and he noticed that the best ones had small little they didn't repeat the same movement. There were small little adaptations in every time they swung the hammer, but they still achieved the task outcome every time of hitting the thing in place. So with repetition, without repetition and practice, we design tasks where the players have to solve the same problem, but in slightly different ways every time. So, like scoring a goal would be the problem, um, and then this we might have them starting in a slightly different position. The defender would be in a different position. The We could change it that like the score, there might be a time, there might be whatever. We're just changing it slightly depending on what our goal is. So with beginners, if we were doing it with beginners, we wouldn't make huge changes. So like when you're talking about like sizing the problem there, we wouldn't have them like trying loads of different things. We'd be kind of doing small little modifications each time, but they're still kind of solving the problem in a slightly different way. Whereas with like the kind of maybe the NHL players, um, if you're trying to improve their shooting, you might like increase the kind of the difference in every problem even more because they're more skilled and you're trying to make them adapt more. Whereas with the beginners, we're just kind of getting them to explore different ways of doing it at the start. So that's kind of links into the, I suppose, sizing the problem like you were talking about there.
Yeah, and like novice players, they need to work on like maybe their shot, like how do I make this puck go? How do I
Yeah,
get some velocity? How do we get some accuracy? But as soon as you're got the basics down, a lot of it's like, how do I get to spots where I can actually use the shot? Like that's the real problem. And then the other piece of that is like, how do I get shots through in a crowded environment where there's sticks in the way, there's bodies in the way? How do I make those little micro adjustments based on um, the opponent, what's available? So I think that leads perfectly into another key principle, which is, we need to develop relevant information. So like the old perception action coupling, where we've
yeah,
got to perceive before we take an action, and that is a key element of it. Like I always go back to the same example. I had a teammate in college. He was really good at the toe drag, and that was pretty
yeah.
much the only solution he had in his bag at that time. So if there was a problem, a toe drag was going to solve it. Because of that, I believe he probably blew out both of his knees on toe drags when he shouldn't have been doing a toe drag. But I bet he was really good about doing it around a cone at practice. But in an actual game, it was definitely a problem rather than a helpful thing.
Yeah, so I suppose with the like the information movement coupling, so that sounds quite hard. What a nice way to kind of think about it is like it's a kind of circular relationship. So it comes from a concept by a psychologist called J.J. Gibson, and the premise of it is like when we move, we pick up information. That information is then how going to influence how we move, or like cause us to move further. Then we pick up more information. It's just a kind of circular relationship. So we want to kind of keep the information that they're going to be using in a game or in the kind of performance environment. we want to try to kind of replicate some of that in practice tasks. So it goes back to kind of like the task simplification we were talking about earlier. So if a player was struggling with a shot, um, we don't really just get them shooting into the empty net with no defenders, and like we might we might give them a bit more time by making the disadvantaging the defender. We could make the goal bigger if we really needed to make it easier for them. Um, we could um like chain. I don't know. I'm not really sure if you could do it, but you could make the puck easier for them to hit. Like in tennis, we have like different balls for like different levels. I'm not really sure about the pucks. Ice hockey isn't really a sport in Ireland, but there might be something like that. But the premise really is just like we simplify the task rather than like taking them completely out of the environment and working on the skill and then kind of just dumping them back in the environment and hoping it kind of works. Whereas we're kind of like there is kind of a skill in it where you simplify it enough. The important information is still there. So it's kind of like what's a nice phrase? Oh, what's the phrase again? There's like a minimum effective dose. That's a nice way I've heard it described. So like we keep that minimum amount of information that it would need to be representative. We we reduce the kind of complexity of the task, but we keep that information and the movement coupled as much as possible.
Yes, we don't want to just completely remove, work on this piece, and then dump it back in. Like
Yeah.
there's like where's really the issue? Like my favorite question in all of sport in general is like, what did you see? Like, was the issue you couldn't execute? Was the issue you analyzed wrong, or did you not even see it all together? So like, do we need to be working on looking around better and more often? Do we need to work on okay, how do we go about our decision making tree of sorts? You know, if this, then what? Or is it truly an execution issue where it's like, ah, he struggles to do this or she struggles to do that? Um, Rather than, yeah, just taking it out, working our shot and plunking it back in. Like the shot, you're going to get better at what you work on. Is it actually the effective issue that needs to be addressed? Or is it somewhere else in the domino chain?
Yeah, and I suppose like there wouldn't be a it's I suppose in our practice tasks we would try have like that idea of task simplification as much as possible. If a player is by themselves, there's no other person to practice with, and they work on their shot a bit. That's like it's not really a problem, but it's more in like in our practice tasks that we're not doing that. Like the players we have present are really going to be the most like valuable resource as a coach, and like they're going to kind of help those other players like become better decision makers, be more adaptable, things like that, which is the goal when you're coaching using a constraints led approach. So um in our practice tasks we keep the information movement coupling as much as possible. If there's a player and they want to do a small bit extra work and they go practice by themselves, we're not going to stop them doing that. And it's great that they might do that. Like they love the sport, but in our practice tasks that we're not really doing tasks like that as much as possible.
There's times and places for everything, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
we don't want to go to that well too much.
No,
Um,
and like it's just I suppose understanding the why behind you're doing certain tasks and kind of if you can justify it from a like say you have a big game at the weekend and skill learning isn't your priority for that game. You're just gonna a nice easy session to get them through it. You might use as many as of the skill learning principles, but if learning is your goal, then then this is where you kind of use a lot of these principles.
if we're not teaching and they're not learning, it's kind of a not
Yeah, well, I
complete
suppose like
waste,
there's just
but it's
different
a missed opportunity.
yeah, and I suppose like skill acquisition is a part of coaching. It's an important part, but it's not everything. So like there are times where skill acquisition mightn't be your priority.
Yeah. So you kind of dived into nibbling at this, but I would say the maybe the last or the next principle for design would just be around like where do we put the attention? Like as a coach, you know, you think about your currency. You know, creating the environment is one thing. The other is guiding their focus. So what are they thinking about, right? Like where do we put that focus of attention through activities, design, sessions?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because it was actually one of the first kind of I would have been reading a lot of the attentional focus research before I even knew what a constraint and set approach was. Because it's kind of like such a big field in itself. So, um, people might have seen things like the external versus extra or internal focus of attention. There's loads of books. One of the books I read, I would have been 15 maybe, was called The Inner Game of Tennis, and it kind of was really promoting, yeah, an external focus of attention. And I found it really, really good when I was applying it. So I became really interested in it. And it was actually through that I came across a lot of the constraint side approach stuff. But in I suppose there's two ways to look at it. The first one is with our movements, a lot of the time, and there's a lot of research that shows it, that focusing externally, like things like analogies or things away from your body, is going to be more effective for the kind of performance of the movement. So, but in, I suppose, a constraint set approach, that's not the only thing that's going to be important. So one of the benefits of using an external focus of attention from a kind of constraint set approach point of view is that you're drawing their attention to the key information and environment. So if you're focusing really like on your body, you're not picking up the key information that's going to help your decision making. So one of the big benefits of kind of promoting that external kind of looking outwards, I suppose, view is that they're able to pick up the information to help their decision making more effectively.
I've worked with a few athletes, and I would say this is a big issue. They may not be the most prevalent issue that you see, but you will definitely see it as a coach, where you get the players that are like too much in their mind. Whether like they immediately go to good or bad in their analysis rather than like, oh, what happened, and just gathering proper information before they attach good or bad. Or they're just so much in their mind, whether that's through coaching or just natural personality of like, oh, what do I need to do to effectively make this turn, coach? Well, okay, we may be focusing on the wrong stuff. We're like so internal that we're forgetting about a lot of the other items, which is this is a sport with opponents that need to be addressed. Maybe that's more effective in swimming and gymnastics, but in invasion sports in particular, like ice hockey, Gaelic football, the good sports out there. You need to know the environment, and you need to be thinking beyond yourself to that. So like I know for me personally, a lot of my language now is like we need to explode towards that rather than
Yeah.
you need to get deeper in your knee bend.
Yeah, and we kind of mentioned the book at the start in our conversation, like The Language of Coaching. That book is a brilliant book if anyone wants to kind of learn a bit more about the attention stuff. About kind of like cueing externally, like you just did there, like exploding away rather than kind of like plant your foot hard. Like it will get the same result really, but it's just kind of like it takes your focus away from your body movements, which is kind of which a lot of research has shown to be a lot more effective for like the performance of movement.
So on the bookshelf behind me, that one is the inner game of tennis. Big fan.
Oh, cool.
Um,
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
but it's still a challenge with those players to kind of get them out of their mind. Like it's not something they can do easily once they're there. It definitely takes a process of getting them out, and I definitely recommend the inner game of tennis. And I would definitely say that helps um, more than other strategies I've tried to get the kids out of their own head and trying to perceive better and more. Which leads me to something that I'm passionate about is like we're guiding eyes, we're guiding minds, but like how do we create better learners? Like we can be great at creating environments, great at teaching, but we also need to help them become better learners, more in tune with their environment, etc., to help get the most out of their skill acquisition. So
Yeah.
curious from someone who's actually read a lot more research rather than me, who's stumbling along, bumbling along, talking to people who are much smarter about these things.
Yeah, I suppose if I had all the answers to that question, I'd probably be a billionaire maybe, but I don't know. But no, there's definitely like there's going to be a lot of different factors that are going to affect that. Like I know like there's going to be one nice kind of theory is called like self-determination theory of motivation. So there's kind of three aspects to it. So there's going to be like autonomy. The players have kind of certain choices, kind of they feel like they are in some way have some sort of control. And it can be simple things like the example I gave at the start, where even get to pick which level of the task they're choosing. And like they don't have a huge choice, but it's just like they still made a decision themselves. I'm not telling them where to go. So that would be autonomy. Then competence would be the other section, and that's just kind of that the challenge is suitable, and that's where like the principle of kind of task simplification and kind of getting the challenge right is going to be really important. So, like a nice kind of rule of thumb would be, um, they should be kind of successful around 70-ish% of the time. There's kind of like a theory called or a framework called the challenge point framework, and there's a nice saying. It's kind of like um you learn from your mistakes, but you're motivated by your success. So you kind of have to get that nice balance. So like if you want them to kind of if you want them to feel like they're good at it, they like that's a nice kind of ratio to aim for, around 70%. If they're more than 70%, you probably have to make it a bit more challenging. So if they're getting things, if they're doing it 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10, you're going to increase the challenge a bit. But if they're only getting it 3 or 4 times out of 10, you're going to decrease the challenge, like simplify it even further. And then relatedness is just like that it's kind of like belonging, I suppose, that they're kind of part of the team, that they're um and that they're kind of and that the coach kind of cares about them. And that's going to be really, really important, that like they know that you like one of my college lecturers used to, I think every single lecturer used to say, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And at the time I was like, oh, will he ever stop saying that every single class? But it's so important now that like I'm kind of in the teaching and in the coaching world. So um kind of hitting on those things is one kind of way to hopefully increase the kind of motivation to learn and kind of become a better learner.
As you're talking, I was thinking about another challenge um, around like I would say 60 to 70% is kind of that right zone I find for players of, to your point, motivated by the success, but you have enough failure where you're constantly learning and you're like, okay, I can do better, I can do better. Um, and there are some players, again, trying to get out of our own way. It's the self-defeating behaviors that we all have, where they view like every mistake as like, oh, the end of the world, rather than, you know, understanding that perfection isn't going to happen. Other people are trying, like there's factors out of your control. Like getting to the point where, again, we're not labeling the action, we're analyzing, okay, what caused this? Was it a good read? It just
Yeah.
didn't work because it got unlucky, it hit someone's skate, whatever that may be, rather than like trying to get them to the point of refining their process in whether it be decision making, movement, execution, whatever it is, rather than judging things by outcomes. I find
Yeah,
that
and
to be an issue for players.
I think a lot of that comes from like the coach. So, and it might be like, or even parents and things, that like I know sometimes when I start, like when I'm working with players that I haven't worked with before, they're not really used to, like, one, in tennis, I don't know if it's the same in ice hockey, it's kind of like you're not supposed to be making mistakes in practice. Practice, you don't make mistakes. It's supposed to be perfect. Like perfect practice makes perfect, or whatever, all those kind of sayings that were around the place. Whereas like when we're to for the kind of decision making, we want some sort of messiness. We want them kind of making mistakes. And when you kind of get that value across to them, that look, I actually want you to explore. If you're not kind of making these mistakes, I'm not really challenging you enough, and you're not kind of progressing. So that's an important kind of thing the coaches need to do. And like I don't think kids kind of naturally kind of gravitate towards that. Like you see them playing like video games and things like that, where there's no adults involved, and like they make mistakes, but they keep going, keep going, keep going. They're kind of motivated by that. So it's kind of like getting that desirable difficulty. They call it like pleasantly frustrating. So like it's kind of, you can do it if you keep going. Um, and then kind of you as a coach kind of encouraging them to explore, not kind of like, if you, even in practice, if like they're making mistakes and you think that's fine, but then in a game, if they make a mistake in like like you jump on them, you're kind of giving out to them for making a mistake in a game. That won't like help them kind of encourage to explore it as well. So it takes a kind of mindset shift from the coach and the players, I think, and it can take a small bit of time, and like especially when you're if you were doing this with players at first, you might like you have to kind of meet them where they're at and kind of bring them to where you want them to be. So like at first they mightn't be comfortable making mistakes, so you might like have to level a challenge slightly higher so they're not making as much, but then kind of gradually lower it to around that 6, 7 out of 10, as they kind of get more comfortable and more used to making those mistakes. So that's kind of my opinion on that anyway.
Yeah, and this all kind of dabbles on like self-organization, self-discovery. I was talking yesterday with a parent around they were getting a shooting lesson for their son, and it's like, so what is he doing on his end? Like, is this just let's go and listen to someone talk about it, or is this part of a bigger picture of like the kid wants to have a better shot? What can you do on your own? How can you, to your point, have like that self-determination that, I can figure this out. I can do this. Be comfortable with that autonomy and just, helping build that confidence of I can figure it out, which goes well beyond, the athletic field and so much into life. And I would say creates a fuller, more purposeful, enriched life.
Yeah, definitely. Like I suppose we're trying to like with our coaching is like if you think about it, there's not going to be many of them make professional. Um, so like it's about kind of giving you're hopefully developing those life skills as well in the process of kind of trying things, learning to learn. Like they call it, there's a lovely paper that looks at kind of toddlers and learning to walk, and like they call it, they're learning to learn how to move. So like they kind of gradually, like if you look at a child, kind of there's different stages they go through, and they're learning to learn how to move. And I suppose that's what we're kind of trying to do with the players we're working with. We're kind of like they're learning to learn how to learn is a kind of nice way to think about it as a coach.
I was bribing my son with goldfish, like, come on, let's walk over here.
Yeah.
Here's a goldfish.
Yeah.
Basics, really scaling it down to, trying to beat him where he's at. But a
Yeah.
lot of fun there. Um, the last thing that I really want to touch on is around the idea of what is skill, and more importantly, thinking about the importance of variability within, and I'll put this in air quotes, skill acquisition, which
Yeah.
I think you can talk on yourself for an hour. So I'm just going to open that Pandora's box and let you have at it.
Yeah. So I suppose when I even like as a player and when I was starting off in college and things like that in my PE teaching, like it was all about, like if my technique gets better, I'll get better. Um, and like technique was about like fitting into this kind of like I suppose they call it like a textbook technique, like it's kind of like this is the way you do it. Everyone does it, no matter if you're 6'7" or you're 5'8", this is how you hit the shot. And it's just I suppose from as I started reading more and more into skill acquisition, a really nice kind of paper they kind of talked about it should be skill adaptability rather than skill acquisition. So like if we look at what like technique, so technique would be kind of like a skill applied in a context. So unless you're kind of like applying it in a context, right, there's no real like you can look really good, but can you apply it in a context and can you actually get your goal in the can you adapt it to the different contexts to kind of like achieve your goal? um so that's gonna when you view skill as like the ability to adapt to like the environment, or the context that you're in, I think it's gonna like change the way that you kind of design your practices. It's gonna change the way that you kind of think about skill learning. And like the constraints-led approach is one way that you can kind of do some of these ideas. There's other ways if people wanted to explore, but like that's kind of the area that I'm interested in. So like rather than repeating techniques and like even going back to that like example we talked earlier about like Nikolai Bernstein and like even a simple task but like simple compared to hitting an ice hockey puck when there's three defenders chasing you is like hammering, the blacksmith hammering. And even in a simple task like that, the best ones weren't, they don't repeat the same movement. It's impossible to repeat the same movement, because like the context is going to change, and like you as a person are changing all the time too. Like even things like fatigue, tiredness, things like that are going to creep in, and you're going to have to adapt to that. So if you are listening at home and you want to kind of do a little test, it's I heard this from a guy called Ian Renshaw. He's really, really good. If you should look up, you should try to listen to some of the podcasts he's on. But one kind of little experiment that he does with his students is that he gets them to draw two dots on a paper 10 centimeters apart, and with a pen, try draw a straight line 10 times between the two dots without lifting your pen. You won't be able to do a straight line. So even in a simple task like that, you can't repeat the same movement exactly. So in a more complex environment, when there's defenders, there's um like your ice hockey. I don't know how they do it. I can barely ice skate, so I'm in awe of them skating like that and performing all the skills. So it's kind of that. I suppose it speaks to that like how can you repeat a movement exactly in an environment like that when it's nearly when you can't do it with a pen and a piece of paper just in front of you.
I've got a friend of mine who works with some of the top players in the sport of ice hockey, well-known people. And in the off season, a lot of these players are just working on this idea of like adaptability, variability, like just handling pucks in weird spots. Like the old saying goes, you can't give a good player a bad pass. Or like, how are they getting a shot off? Like you would never ever do this type of movement and shoot this direction or this way in a normal shooting session because it's not going to be, powerful and, et cetera, et cetera. It's more about like I can at least get a shot off, and it might be right based on the environment. Like the goalie can't see anything. Well, I don't really need the power in this way. Or like the pucks come into this weird spot where it's a real challenge, but instead of like completely missing it or having to grab it and then, shoot when everyone's had the time to adjust, I can at least get something off. And that's going to mean the difference between scoring 40 goals and scoring 50 goals. And suddenly I've added another few $1 million out of my paycheck. Like it adds up. So rather than finding and trying to figure out what's the perfect hardest shot I can do, it's more about the variability and the adaptability that what's used to, what's awkward or in a weird spot becomes not 100% natural, but very doable and becomes part of that playing range to the point of like, you don't give a bad pass to a good player. They have that ability to make something out of what most players make nothing of.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I like that. And that's a very nice example because like if you think of, I don't know, the most skilled players of all time in those sports, like one of the words that you'd usually use to describe them would be adaptable or like just skillful or whatever. So it's not like they repeat the same thing every single time. There's subtle adaptations, even if it looks similar. There's going to be subtle kind of changes that they do to kind of still achieve the task outcome, which is kind of the essence of that repetition without repetition we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I'm going to share one last story and then I'll shut up. But I coached at a private school up in Cleveland, and I was always like, man, if I was still up in Cleveland and not in Columbus now, I definitely want to send my son to this school, um, because they just had like this like underlying on how they do it, a lot of that self determination where every single athlete was and every single person was just adaptable. Like I can figure things out. Like they're very much on that ability. And I compared that to some of the public schools that I've either witnessed from afar or worked in with those type of players, where it's a little more regimented. And the adaptability and the I can do this confidence just isn't there. And maybe, that could be something to do with you had to, pass the standards to get into there, but from diving into and looking at it and truly like thinking about this, for me it came back to that idea of like consistently the people that are in those environments where they have to figure things out, they have to grow, they need to be independent of sorts and just be able to manage whatever environment they're in. We're always more successful than the ones that were regimented, and especially in the heat of battle when things are going, where you know, you just got to figure out like, how do I handle this situation? We haven't practiced this yet, coach. And they'll figure out the principles. Like they'll get the commander's intent very easily. And it was just a massive difference maker. Like I've seen public schools that have that mentality, like they're very regimented and their players would be quote unquote like super skilled and they were the more skilled team. And then they would just get absolutely buried and lose terribly to a team that was maybe not as skilled. They didn't have the perfect techniques, but they just got after it. They had that assertiveness. They had the adaptability to just make things happen.
So they were more skilled. Yeah, yeah,
That would be
yeah,
my
yeah, yeah.
when
I
I'm
know. Yeah,
talking about like
yeah,
yeah, how what is actual skill? Yes,
yeah, yeah.
but we'll quote
Yeah,
unquote. They're technically
yeah,
better
yeah, yeah. I know, I know.
technique wise. Yeah,
So like, I suppose like those stories are great examples, and like a question to kind of ask yourself then is like, if the game requires the players to adapt, that's what we need to be doing in practice. Like, why don't we practice that way? So like we're trying to get the players used to adapting, used to decision making, used to kind of like performing like context dependent. So like whatever is happening, they're able to adapt to. So like if success at the kind of at any level requires that, then our practices are going to have to kind of try shape that as much as possible.
yeah. Well, I guess I'll do another story too. So I'll practice one time with my players, and like they'll be going down the ice, and it's just kind of like easy, get to know it, like try to get them dropping their weight, like just a simple thing. And some players at first are like, "You got to give me the pass right here." I'm like, "Well, I don't care that your teammate either can't do it one or doesn't do it for whatever reason. Like, adjust your feet and hammer the puck." Like, have you ever been in a game? Like, perfect passes are very rare, very rare. So we should probably have some comfortability with that. Again, what are some ways that we can help players overcome maybe some I don't learning deficiencies, probably not the right term, but some roadblocks and self-defeating behaviors they need to remove in order to best learn and grow.
Yeah, I think it's just about kind of rewarding and looking for that adaptability and kind of making it very clear that that's what you're looking for in your practices. Um, because like if they a lot of the time, I don't know, they might be in their like in Ireland, I don't know, is it the same in hockey that like they could have in school they have a coach, in their club they have a coach, so that like they have three or four different like coaches at a time. Um, and like if some of the other coaches are like really kind of looking for that kind of repeatability, and then you're requiring that adaptability, that can be like a big jump for them. Or if that was what their coach was like for the last 3 or 4 years before that they came to you. So just really kind of making it clear and like prioritizing that exploration, that adaptability, and that like kind of explaining the why and making sure that their parents, which can also be another kind of barrier, are kind of know why you're coaching in that way and why you're doing that. So I think once like the players kind of get comfortable, more comfortable with it, kind of start seeing some improvements and that their parents are on board, that a lot of that kind of goes away.
Always communicate expectations. Wasn't in my notes for today's show, but I absolutely love and adore that because it underlies so much in life. Um, and now I'm thinking back to my preseason meeting I had before this hockey season started, where one of my slides was around I'm not looking for the quote unquote most skilled, technically proficient player. I'm looking for who can get the job done, who's going to be effective, and educating parents and players on why behind the style. Because for many players, it can be a massive shift, or they've never been there, or had coaches that instead of giving the answers, always asking questions back at you.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and they're kind of. I have had. I remember. I was coaching. It was actually my sister. I was coaching her, and she said I was just kind of getting her to explore and kind of asking, kind of not giving her the answers. And she's like, I know you know the answer. Why don't you just tell me? Because like she was just so used to that with the coaches that she had been with before. And like that was at the start. And like by the end, she just like she really enjoyed the kind of different kind of way of coaching. Like tennis can be really, really, really repeatable. It's just a kind of the culture of the sport. So like she wasn't used to not being given the answers and like kind of encouraged to explore different solutions. So it does like if you are making a change or things like that, like there is going to be some kind of teething problems maybe, but once you kind of get over them, it's worth the change in my opinion anyway.
I agree. We'll save that. I want to ask a lot of questions around that, but then we'll be here for another hour. So I think it's a perfect way to end about not giving your sister the answers that she desired right away, and
Yeah,
why that was a benefit to her.
yeah.
But Philip, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate your time and expertise. This was awesome.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, and hopefully I didn't butcher too many of the ice hockey examples. But thanks very much.
Principles are the same. Love it.
Yeah.
That concludes this week's episode. Thanks for joining us here at Hockey IQ. If you haven't already, take a quick moment to hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and drop a review. If you want to be a great teammate, even recommend us to a friend. You can follow us at Hockey's Arsenal on Twitter and Instagram. Check out the website, hockeysarsenal.com, where you can subscribe to the weekly newsletter. You won't regret it. Catch your buttes here next week for a brand new episode.